The teacher said I needed extra tutoring, but I didn't realize I'd be learning more than just lessons after school. The day started like any other, with the familiar hum of students shuffling into the classroom and the scratch of chalk against the blackboard. But there was something different today. Something about the way she moved as she arranged her notes at the desk made it impossible to look away. She wasn't just a teacher, she was a presence, quiet yet commanding, poised with a grace that made even the mundane motions of straightening her papers seem intentional. From the moment I stepped into the classroom, I noticed her. Not in a distracted, fleeting way, but in that rare, slow-burn way where you suddenly become acutely aware of every small detail. The curve of her smile as she greeted the class, the soft tilt of her head when listening to a question, the way her fingers lingered on the edges of her books, almost absent-mindedly. She carried herself with confidence, yet there was a subtle vulnerability behind her eyes, as if she were carrying the weight of 1,000 untold stories. I found my gaze lingering longer than it should. The sunlight streaming through the window caught her hair at just the right angle, a gentle halo of amber that contrasted with the neat, professional attire she wore. There was a scent, soft, warm, familiar, like vanilla and old books, something that made the edges of my mind feel both alert and oddly comforted. The sound of her voice, calm and steady while explaining a complicated concept, seemed to resonate in the quiet corners of the room, and for a moment, the world outside the classroom ceased to exist. Even the smallest gestures caught my attention. The way she shifted slightly when walking past the desks, the slight brushing of her hand against the chalkboard as she wrote, the faint exhale when she leaned over to adjust a paper, each movement carried a weight I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just physical presence, it was the subtle emotional aura she radiated, a combination of confidence, care, and unspoken longing. And yet, beneath my fascination, there was hesitation. I felt a quiet tension coil inside me. This wasn't just admiration. I was drawn to her, compelled by something I couldn't yet name. But there was the age gap, the unspoken boundaries of student and teacher, a barrier that made every glance, every accidental brush of her hand feel both electrifying and forbidden. By the end of class, I realized that something had shifted. What began as simple attention had become a quiet, insistent pull, an awareness of her presence that lingered long after the classroom emptied. I wasn't just noticing her anymore. I was waiting, without quite knowing for what, for the moment she would call me after class and, unknowingly, set the stage for everything that was about to change. The classroom had emptied, leaving only the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant chatter of students in the hallway. I lingered near my desk, pretending to organize my notes, though my thoughts were anything but focused. That's when she approached, quiet, deliberate, and unhurried, like someone who owns both the room and the moment. "Hey," she said, her voice low but warm, carrying a softness I hadn't noticed in the rush of the morning's lessons. "I noticed you've been struggling a bit with some of the concepts. I think a few extra sessions after school could really help." It was professional, matter of fact, but something in the way she looked at me made the air feel heavier, charged with unspoken meaning. Her eyes, steady and observant, seemed to linger just a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I could feel the quiet weight of her attention settle over me. It wasn't just concern for my grades, it was a subtle acknowledgement of me, of my presence in her world, however small. As she gestured toward the textbook, her hand hovered near mine for just a moment, brushing lightly against the edge of the desk. A warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. I felt it in my chest, a fluttering, nervous sort of anticipation that made my palms slightly clammy and my throat tight. The proximity, brief as it was electric without a word being exchanged. I nodded, trying to mask my sudden awareness of her nearness. Okay, I managed, my voice a little uneven. She smiled then, not the formal, polite smile she reserved for the class, but a softer one, intimate and quietly encouraging. It reached her eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that made her seem both youthful and timeless at once. She gathered her notes and gave me a gentle nod. "Great. We'll start tomorrow, right after school. Don't worry, you're not in trouble, I just think this could help." As she walked back toward the door, I felt a small pang of disappointment, almost like a tug at my chest, that the moment was ending. The subtle tension in the room lingered long after she left, the faint echo of her voice, the soft warmth of her hand near mine, the way her presence seemed to stretch time itself. I sat back in my chair, heart still racing, and realized I was looking forward to tomorrow, not just to learning, but to seeing her again, to being in that small, quiet space where the world outside didn't exist and it was just the two of us. For the first time, the idea of extra tutoring didn't feel like a chore, it felt like an invitation into something I couldn't yet name, something that had already begun to shift the rhythm of my days. The classroom felt different after school. The usual buzz of students was replaced by quiet, only the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the floorboards under her shoes. I arrived early, my backpack heavier than usual, though not with books, more with anticipation I could hardly name. She was already there, sitting at a desk near the window, the afternoon light catching her hair just so, casting a halo around her profile that made her seem almost unreal in the stillness. "Glad you could make it," she said, looking up from her notes with a gentle smile. There was a warmth in her voice that settled over me like a blanket, both comforting and disarming. I nodded, my usual confidence dissolving into a quiet, nervous awareness of being close to her. As we settled into our work, the air seemed charged with small, almost imperceptible moments. Sitting across from her, our knees nearly brushing under the desk, I became acutely aware of the rhythm of her movements, the way she leaned over to point at a problem in my textbook, the soft brush of her hair against her cheek as she concentrated, the subtle exhale she released when I finally understood a tricky concept. Each gesture felt deliberate and intimate without ever crossing a line. Her patience was remarkable. She guided me through problems with quiet encouragement, her fingertips sometimes lingering on the pages, brushing mine briefly as she corrected an error. The contact was fleeting, but enough to send warmth spiraling through me, a physical echo of the emotional tension building between us. Every glance she gave carried a weight of meaning, a mixture of kindness, attentiveness, and something I couldn't quite name yet. The quiet moments in between instructions were almost unbearable. I noticed the way the sunlight shifted across the room, illuminating her thoughtful expression. The faint scent of her perfume, mingling with the musty comfort of old textbooks, was dizzying in its familiarity. My chest tightened with a mixture of longing and hesitation, every second in her presence was a tug-of-war between admiration and desire. Even as I focused on algebra and grammar, I was hyper-aware of her proximity. The simple act of her leaning slightly to correct my posture, her hand brushing mine for a heartbeat, felt like a revelation. I wanted to linger in that space, to extend the moment indefinitely, but the quiet propriety of our roles reminded me to tread carefully. By the end of the session, my mind was buzzing, not just with knowledge gained, but with the electric intimacy of our shared space. I packed up my things slowly, reluctant to leave the warmth of the room, the comfort of her presence, and the quiet pull of a connection that promised so much yet remained tantalizingly just out of reach. Another afternoon after school, and the classroom felt quieter than ever, as if the world outside had paused to give us this small, suspended moment. The usual hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant echoes of students in the hall, everything faded into the background. It was just her and me, sitting across the desk from each other, the textbooks between us serving more as a bridge than a barrier. This time, she lingered over a particularly tricky problem, her hand resting lightly on the corner of my notebook as she guided me. But instead of focusing solely on the lesson, her eyes softened, and she began to talk about herself, a rare glimpse into the person behind the teacher. She spoke of past struggles, small regrets, and fleeting moments of insecurity that she rarely shared with anyone. Her voice was gentle, almost hesitant at first, as if revealing these details made her feel unusually exposed. I listened, captivated, feeling the quiet intimacy of the moment. There was no judgment, no condescension, just an honest sharing of her human side. My chest tightened with a mix of empathy and something deeper I couldn't quite name. I realized that I was seeing her not as a figure of authority, but as someone capable of vulnerability, someone I could relate to in subtle, profound ways. Her hand brushed mine once more, this time to emphasize a point, lingering just long enough for the warmth to spread through me, sending an unspoken message of reassurance and connection. My own fingers twitched, almost unconsciously reaching a fraction closer before hesitation held me back. The tension between propriety and desire hummed quietly, like electricity in the still air. She laughed softly at one of my hesitant jokes, a sound so natural and warm that it wrapped around me like sunlight. I noticed the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, how her posture relaxed when she let down her guard, and I felt a pull toward her that went beyond mere admiration. The quiet exchange of vulnerability had opened a door, one that neither of us was ready to step fully through, yet both of us lingered near its threshold. The tutoring session ended with an almost imperceptible pause, a lingering glance that held more meaning than words could convey. I packed up my things slowly, savoring the warmth of her hand brushing mine as she returned a paper. The room felt charged with unspoken understanding, a quiet intimacy that lingered even as I walked toward the door, my thoughts replaying every fleeting touch, every glance, every pause. For the first time, I realized that learning from her wasn't just about the lessons in the textbook, it was about understanding the layers beneath her composed exterior, about sharing moments of quiet honesty that made the world outside disappear. And with that realization came a subtle, undeniable ache, a longing that neither of us could yet define, but that promised something far more meaningful than academic success. As the days passed, the tutoring sessions became a routine I found myself quietly anticipating. The classroom, once just a place for learning, had transformed into a private stage for small, significant exchanges. Every moment spent there carried a subtle weight, a tension neither of us dared to name, yet both of us felt acutely. We often lingered after finishing the lesson, poring over the same problems not because they required it, but because the space between us was magnetic. Sitting side by side at the desk, our knees sometimes brushing, I became acutely aware of the warmth of her presence. Every small gesture, the way she leaned over to point something out, the slight shift of her hand to rest near mine, the soft brush of her hair as she tucked it behind her ear, felt deliberate, intimate, and charged with emotion I could scarcely comprehend. There were small rituals that began to form, sharing coffee from the vending machine in the hallway, exchanging quiet jokes over corrected homework, or simply walking out together in companionable silence as the sun dipped low, casting the school in golden light. In these fleeting interludes, her laughter seemed to linger longer, her gaze held more meaning, and the ordinary became extraordinary. I noticed her attention to details I had never expected, how she remembered a book I mentioned liking, the way she adjusted my posture gently when she thought I looked tense, or the soft encouragement in her tone when I solved a problem correctly. Each of these gestures created a warmth that settled deep in my chest, a quiet thrill that pulsed with every subtle touch. Even the accidental brushing of our arms across the table seemed electric, leaving a lingering heat that refused to dissipate. Yet, amid this closeness, the tension of propriety remained. I was painfully aware of the boundaries between us, of the unspoken lines neither of us dared cross. And that awareness made the small moments, her hand resting briefly on my shoulder, a shared laugh, the way her eyes met mine and held, feel infinitely more significant. Every touch, every glance, carried a gravity that could not be ignored. By the end of each session, there was a lingering ache of reluctance to leave the warmth and intimacy of her presence. The classroom felt empty without her, and yet my thoughts remained filled with her, the soft brush of her hand, the sound of her laughter, the quiet magnetism that drew me toward her again and again. What had begun as tutoring had blossomed into something far more potent, a connection that was both comforting and thrilling, slow-burning and irresistible, quietly redefining the rhythm of my days and my thoughts. The late afternoon light poured through the classroom windows, casting long, golden streaks across the desks. The day's tutoring session had been particularly intense, challenging problems, careful explanations, and moments where I faltered and she guided me patiently back on track. But by the end, it wasn't just my understanding of the material that had deepened, the quiet tension between us had grown palpable, almost tangible in the air. She leaned over my notebook, her shoulder brushing mine briefly, and I felt a warmth radiate through me that had nothing to do with the sun on my back. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of the desk, and for a heartbeat, I caught her gaze. The look she gave me wasn't strictly teacherly anymore, there was something softer, more personal, an acknowledgement that the space we shared had shifted into something deeper, more meaningful. "Great work today," she said softly, her voice a blend of pride and reassurance. The words themselves were simple, but the way they were delivered, the slight tilt of her head, the warmth in her eyes, the almost imperceptible smile, made the moment feel weighty, intimate. I felt my chest tighten, a mixture of exhilaration and hesitation swirling inside me. Every fiber of my being wanted to reach closer, to linger in that quiet, charged space. The proximity of our bodies, even as we remained seated across from each other, felt electric. Her hand briefly touched my forearm as she passed me a sheet of paper, lingering just long enough for a spark to pass through me. The subtle brush was almost unbearable in its intensity, a silent communication of connection, warmth, and unspoken desire. My mind raced with questions: was this mutual, or merely a byproduct of shared focus? But my heart was already answering them, even if my lips could not. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink, the world outside fading entirely. I noticed the soft exhale she released as she straightened, the way her hair caught the light, the delicate scent of her perfume that seemed to wrap around me like a comforting embrace. There was a pause, a moment where neither of us moved, yet the silence spoke volumes. It was a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had been building between us, the admiration, the longing, the subtle electric tension of a connection that had grown far beyond tutoring. As I packed my books, reluctant to leave the warmth of the room and the intensity of her presence, I realized that what I felt was no longer simple admiration. It was deeper, richer, complicated, a slow-burning, undeniable pull towards someone I respected, cherished, and quietly desired. And in that shared, lingering moment, I understood that our connection had reached a turning point, a peak of emotional intimacy that would forever change the rhythm of our afternoons together. The final tutoring session of the term had arrived, and the classroom felt like a space suspended between endings and beginnings. The sunlight poured softly through the windows, casting a golden glow over the familiar rows of desks. There was a quiet comfort in the stillness, an intimacy that had developed slowly over weeks of shared moments, laughter, and quiet concentration. We began the session as always, reviewing problems and clarifying concepts, but this time, the atmosphere carried a warmth that went beyond academics. The small gestures, the brush of her hand against mine while pointing to a question, the subtle leaning closer to explain a concept, the shared laughter over minor mistakes, had become natural, effortless, and deeply comforting. Every movement, every glance, carried a tenderness that neither of us needed to explain. At one point, as I finally solved a particularly tricky problem on my own, she looked at me with genuine pride. Her smile was soft and full of quiet satisfaction, her eyes holding a warmth that went far beyond teacherly encouragement. "You've come so far," she said, her voice gentle yet vibrant with emotion. I felt a swell of gratitude, admiration, and something more, a longing to linger in her presence that I didn't want to suppress. As the session drew to a close, she handed me my completed work, her fingers brushing mine lightly. The touch lingered just long enough to make my chest tighten, but it was filled with reassurance rather than expectation. I returned her smile, realizing that what had grown between us was more than a simple connection, it was trust, respect, and a quietly powerful affection that had developed naturally, beautifully, and without haste. Before leaving, she rested her hand briefly on my shoulder, a gesture so small and yet so profoundly intimate. I felt the warmth of her touch settle into me, a soft reminder of everything we had shared, moments of laughter, vulnerability, guidance, and subtle closeness that had shaped the rhythm of our afternoons. We exchanged a lingering look, full of unspoken understanding, appreciation, and gentle longing, before stepping back and returning to our respective worlds. Walking out of the classroom, I realized that the experience had changed me, not just academically, but emotionally. I had learned about patience, vulnerability, and the quiet power of connection. I had discovered that respect and admiration could coexist with desire, and that meaningful intimacy could exist without crossing boundaries. By the end, the story of our tutoring sessions was complete, yet it left a lingering warmth in both our hearts. The age gap, the professional context, and the quiet propriety of our roles had never diminished the depth of our bond. We had built something rare and lasting, a connection rooted in understanding, gentle affection, and slow-burning trust, a connection that would remain with us long after the classroom had emptied and the final bell had rung. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. There's more slow-burn romance waiting for you in the next video. Check the link in the description to continue the journey.